Hello my lovelies and welcome back to my channel. I'm Heather and this is the happenings with H.A.P. H.A.P. meaning my initials. Today's video is, as it said, it is my September reading wrap up. I read a bunch of books this month and I really use this month as kind of my, what's the word? Amuse-bouche for the type of reading that I was going to be doing in October. So the majority of these books are actually thrillers, horror, so kind of creepy, so that I could ease myself into what I will be reading in October, which if you have not watched my October TBR, do so. I will put it in the cards right above. And yeah, as always, if you are new here, welcome. I hope you enjoy my content. And if you're returning, thank you for returning as always. If you haven't, please subscribe down below. Click the bell notification so you know when I post a new video. Like, dislike, leave a comment, do what you like, but I hope that you guys are continuing to enjoy my content. And with all of that out of the way, let's get into my September reading wrap up. The first book I read this month was Imaginary Friend by Chbosky. I was really excited to read this. I had been wanting to read this when it first came out last October or November, but I didn't get a chance to read it because it took forever to get from my library, but I finally got to sit down and read this. This is Chbosky's second book ever, at least published book ever, and this was his follow-up to The Perks of Being a Wallflower. So he already had his own big shoes to fill when it came to publishing this book, because the expectation, I know, even for myself, and I try to temper that, had to have been high. I enjoyed this one. It is not perfect. I would say that I felt it fell apart a wee bit towards the end, and that was unfortunate. I will say that for atmosphere, this book had it. I was definitely creeped out at some things reading it. This novel primarily follows Christopher and Kate Reese. Christopher is her son, and they escape to the western part of Pennsylvania to escape an abusive boyfriend and basically start over. Kate is a widow. Her husband committed suicide, so it's just her and Christopher. Christopher deals with some types of trauma and is academically a bit slow, so he's put in a lot of the slower classes and gets, of course, bullied for it and stuff like that. But he does end up having a very core group of friends. And one day he is mysteriously led to these woods that are by a construction site not too far from his house. And he is missing for a week. Obviously, his mother's frantic. Everyone goes searching for him, and he ends up coming out of the woods perfectly unharmed, saying that the nice man helped him out. And what's really strange is that when he comes back, he suddenly is able to pick up reading. He's suddenly able to do math very quickly. It's like basically a switch was turned and he's pretty much a genius. And by some sort of probably supernatural hunch, whatever, his mother actually ends up playing, I believe it's the numbers on one of his math tests, and ends up winning the lottery, which takes them out of the motel they were living in into a really nice house and basically gives them the opportunity to completely start over. So everything seems to be going really great for Kate and her son. She still has her job, but they have an actual house that's theirs. He's doing well in school now, so everything seems to be fine and dandy. Until he gets told by the nice man that he needs to build a tree house in the middle of the woods where he had gone missing. Otherwise, his mother and the rest of the town will die. That is the basic synopsis of the novel. Even while reading it, I was wondering where the supernatural element was going to go. And it actually very much hinges on religion, in that one of the main characters is the devil and the other is some sort of type of Mother Nature type of a character. Christopher does end up having to literally go to hell and back to try to save this town. The reason why he becomes so intelligent and everything else is because he's given godlike powers and he can actually heal. So he does have the power of God within him. I really enjoyed the fact that it went into religion in this very, very straight-lined good versus evil way. I just felt it kind of fell apart a little bit towards the end. The imagery was really interesting, and when you actually find out what the whole plan has been, I saw it coming earlier than the book tells you, but not that early. It wasn't a surprise, but I don't know. I don't know why the ending I didn't love as much. I guess because things do get wrapped up in a neat little bow. I'm not always a big fan of that. It was still very enjoyable. I will say, and this is probably a main criticism that pretty much almost every review has probably had for this novel, is that it was just too long. I read the audiobook, and the audiobook was a good maybe 28 hours or something like that. That was a big part of it. Like, it could have cut probably about an hour or two out and you would not have even noticed. There are a lot of elements in this novel that are very harsh realities of child abuse, molestation, and stuff like that. So maybe have that in your mind that stuff like that might happen, because he is not one to shy away. For anyone that's read Perks of Being a Wallflower, you know that. But I did really enjoy this one. It wasn't everything I wanted it to be, but I liked the risk, because coming from Perks of Being a Wallflower, which is now like taught in schools, to having to follow that up, that's just a huge gamble and a huge risk. And I think it paid off really well. I just think the main thing was that it was too long, and it just felt eventually it's like, okay, we have to get to an ending and we have to figure this out. And you kind of felt that a little bit. People might not agree with me if you've read it, and you don't agree with me, or even if you do, leave a comment down below. I'd love to get more people's opinions on this. Most of the people I know haven't read this, or if they have, they don't really talk about it too much. It is dense. It's very plot dense. There's a lot that happens, but I really enjoyed it, and it was definitely lived up to the spook factor. I was creeped out, so I can say with certainty Stephen Chbosky can write very creepy prose, and it will creep you out. The next book that I read is The Lost Book of the White by Cassandra, Clare, and Wesley Chu. This is the second book in the Eldest Curses trilogy, which was originally said to be an adult Shadowhunters trilogy, but I believe now it's been just rebranded as YA, because the first one was definitely not adult and this one really wasn't either. This felt like a regular Shadowhunter book, so I don't know. I guess it is just now considered YA. Whatever. As I've said in the past, I wasn't a huge fan of the Red Schools of Magic. However, I did enjoy The Lost Book of the White way more. And I think it's because we're actually starting to get to the reason why this trilogy exists in the first place, and I will go into it. For Shadowhunter fans, if you don't want to be spoiled, maybe go to the next book on this list, because I don't want to spoil it for you, but I will be saying spoilers in this, which will be pretty big spoilers, so FYI, guys. The Lost Book of the White actually takes place, obviously, after the Red Schools of Magic, but in particular to the book timeline, it takes place after the Tales of Shadowhunter Academy anthology and before Lady Midnight and the first book of the Dark Artifices series, so it is in that weird period. Simon has now become a full-fledged Shadowhunter. He and Clary are parabatai. Alec and Magnus have now adopted their warlock son Max. So that is where it's taking place. This one also definitely references a lot of things from the book's past and little teasers of what's to come. So it does talk about the Alliance Rune. That was a way that Clary was able to help the Shadowhunters and Downworlders defeat her father and Sebastian's armies. And we finally actually get some, I don't want to say closure, but just Simon dealing with the death of his friend George from Shadowhunter Academy. Simon's not okay in this. And we basically went from Shadowhunter Academy with Simon getting to be a Shadowhunter to the Dark Artifices, where he was just kind of in the background. So to actually have Simon have these feelings and, you know, express them in this way was really nice. You got to see Jace, Clary, Isabel, and Simon in this, along with obviously Alec and Magnus. So that was really nice to kind of get the gang back together. Of course, the gang has to go to hell again. Basically, whenever they're together, they just always somehow literally end up in a literal hell. Yeah, that just seems par for the course for these guys. Another significant plot point in this book is that it is during this period that Ragnar Fell is still thought to be dead by Magnus himself. The book pretty much opens with the plan that Ragnar made during the Mortal Instrument series in order to escape Valentine, to pretend that he was dead. As we know, he does come back in the Dark Artifices, much to wonderful fanfare. But in this book, Magnus believes he actually had died, and Ragnar Fell and the other warlock, Shin Yun, who was the main antagonist in the Red Schools of Magic, come into their house to take the Book of the White, which Magnus had left hidden in his son Max's room. So they end up taking it, and their tracking leads them to Shanghai, where they actually meet up with the love of all of our lives, Jem Carstairs, and his family. Jem is no longer a silent brother, and he has been cleansed via the heavenly fire and the mortal instruments. And we get to meet his family, and in an effort to try to find Ragnar, they are taken to a portal to a dimension of hell, which Ragnar created, because Ragnar's strength is interdimensional magic. So we find out through all this that Shin Yun and Ragnar are working for Samael, who is a second prince of hell, basically right underneath Lucifer. One thing I love about Cassandra Clare's Greater Demons and Princes of Hell and stuff like that is the different types of personalities. Over the course of the series, we have met a few Princes of Hell and actually spent time with them. We've met Samael Belial, who is Tessa's father, and James and Lucy's grandfather, and Osmodeus, who is Magnus Bane's father. And each of those characters has very different personalities. Samael, the way he's written is very go with the flow. Like when he approaches them, he's written like that he's just kind of like this dude just traveling by and be like, hey, what's that? Let me chat with you. Whereas like Osmodeus is very much like, oh, I know that I am a Prince of Hell and you will know it too. And Belial is trying to be cordial and it just doesn't work. So it's very interesting to see how they all act. Obviously now with the introduction of another Prince of Hell, we are getting closer, especially with the end of this book leaves off, to what the wicked powers shall be about, which is going to be the final trilogy in the Shadowhunters Chronicles, essentially. What we find out too is that Samael is still really pissed off by the fact that Simon ended up killing Lilith with the Mark of Cain. He actually kidnaps Simon and tortures him because of it. And of course, our heroes must not only save Simon, but save the world from Shin-Yun and her craziness of trying to basically destroy the world with Samael. The biggest part of the book that I was shocked by was the epilogue. And if anyone that's read a Shadowhunter novel knows, Cassandra Clare, man, she gets you with those epilogues. And this one was a doozy. Like, I'm shocked that the Shadowhunter community, it's not more on BookTube because it's a biggin. Again, if you don't want to be spoiled, you can turn it off. But the epilogue of this novel sees Samael calling all of the 9 Princes of Hell into basically a little like tribunal together. So we actually get to see all of them. And the basic premise of this little meeting is they've worked apart for so long, but maybe it would make sense to work together. One of the last lines is essentially about bringing back Lucifer. So I don't know what that means. It's not written anywhere what that might mean. I'm sure Cassandra Clare isn't talking, but the wicked powers literally could just kind of be like the Princes of Hell combining to bring back Lucifer and have one final showdown, which if you're gonna end a series of like 5 or 6 trilogies, that would be kind of how you're going to do it. Like I said, this book is now showing me the reason why it was written, because after the first one, I wasn't really sure, and I should have checked myself because, at least in regards to the Shadowhunter series, Cassandra Clare definitely has a plan. And I'm very curious now where the 3rd book in this series is going to go. I'm assuming it will probably be a direct lead up to the first book of the Wicked Powers. We shall see. But yeah, basically the second half on is where this got amazing. And oh man, the years aren't going by fast enough so I can read these books. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to where this series is going to go, as well as what the Wicked Powers will actually be. Chain of Iron is the only book next. And then after that will be the 3rd book in the Eldest Curses series is going to be called The Black Volume of the Dead. So that should give you kind of maybe an idea of where the series is going to go. But definitely was very surprised how much I like this one, and I'm so glad that I liked it more than the first one. So I think I might actually end up rereading the first one whenever I do my big Shadowhunter reread eventually. I definitely enjoyed this one a lot. The next book I read was Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is an Own Voices novel for African American representation, and this is actually the first Tiffany D. Jackson book I've read, and from what little I know about some of her other novels, I think I'm definitely going to pick up more because she definitely likes to write thrillers, and this was a thriller for sure, and also very incredibly tragic. A big trigger warning for extreme child abuse in this novel, so just an FYI, so you know what you're getting yourself into. It follows Claudia, who is starting 8th grade, and her best friend Monday hasn't really been keeping in touch over the summer, and she's hoping when she comes back that they'll be able to, you know, do what they always do at school. Monday doesn't show up for the first day, the second day of school, the first week, the second week, and Claudia is getting worried, but she's finding it weird when she confronts Monday's sister April that April isn't really concerned, and when she confronts teachers about it, they're also not concerned. The fact that Monday and her little brother and sister aren't missing. I'm not going to say much more than that. This was definitely a novel that you have to go into, I would say, blind. The synopsis that you know about is great, but there is a major twist in it, and I don't want to give it away in this, that really kind of shook took me. I would say if you've read Perks of Being a Wallflower, it definitely has those types of vibes with the type of twist that was in this. The novel is really tragic and really beautifully written, and a lot of it actually really reminded me of the Gabriel Fernandez murder case that happened years ago, where a well-meaning teacher had tried to intervene on behalf of a child, and because of the school and the police and CPS and other things was not able to, and unfortunately stuff happened. And this definitely reminded me of that, as well as a part of it was also the high sexualization of young Black girls. It's very subtly put in there, but because of the characters' ages, how sexuality was explored between young girls and how especially Black young girls are already sexualized as an adult even when they're children. And it also brings, as I said, with that case, poor people, how they are often overlooked and thrown under the bus and stuff like that. This novel had a lot of layers. I gave this novel 5 stars, and I've not heard really anybody talk about it, and it was published like 2 years ago, but it definitely made my one of my top lists of the year of books that I loved because of just what was all going on in it. It is definitely a heavy read, and I definitely recommend to be in the proper mindset before you go into it based on the trigger warning that I gave you. But I really suggest reading this one. It was so good, and it really took me by surprise. And the fact that it's young adult, I'm an adult that reads young adult, but there are actually, teenagers and tweens that do read young adult. And I think this one is one that probably, just like with Perks of Being a Wallflower, should probably be taught in schools. There's a lot to dissect with it. There's a lot to talk about with it. For Book of the Month reading clubs, this would be a really good one to read too, because there's just so many layers involved, and they're not as overt as you will see in another novel that I read this month, but it was all there, and it was just really good. And I definitely recommend this one a lot. But I would say if you've read Sadie and you can handle Sadie, you should be able to handle this. But just an FYI to, be in the right headspace to read a book like this. The next book I read was Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This one was on my radar. I'd seen it, a booktuber talk about it, I think, and I put it on my TBR list, and this was obviously the perfect month to read it. This definitely gave me Stephen King vibes, but I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4 stars. The novel follows Maggie Holt, who is 30 years old, and her father has recently passed, and she has inherited, without her knowing that her father still owned it, the childhood house she lived in for 3 weeks that her family fled from in the middle of the night. And her father, Ewan, actually wrote a novel based on their 3 weeks in that house, and it's supposedly haunted. So she drives up to Vermont and is attempting to try to flip the house, resell it, and try to at least make some money off of it. She doesn't remember anything about the house except for what she has read over the years in her father's novel. So she's not sure what exactly was true that he wrote, what wasn't, what is a real memory and what is not. What's really cool about this book is that we have Maggie's present day POV, but then we also have chapters from the book her father wrote that are interspersed in between. So it kind of flip-flops between Maggie's point of view and a chapter in her father's book, and vice versa. And I will say how this was written was very creepy. Like I said, very much Stephen King vibes. The whole fact of the town being mad at her father for writing this book and her life being affected is very much Amityville Horror, which has been proven to be a hoax that the Lutz family wrote to have a book, which is also referenced in this, which I think was very meta. Like I said, it was extremely creepy. I did not see the twist coming, I will say that. It definitely took me by surprise what actually was going on in the house, because throughout the entire novel, you're not sure of what is in her own head, what was placed there by her father's novel, because when she does go back, weird things do start to happen and she's unsure as to why. It's basically about a daughter just dealing with the demons of her parents. Not that she had a bad childhood, but just trying to uncover the truth and what was their life before the house and then what was their life after, and where all the truth actually is going to lie and all that. It was a fun ride. It was definitely creepy. It did satisfy the spooky factor that I was looking for this month. I don't want to give anything away because this is another fun one that you should probably go in not knowing too much, except for a basic synopsis. It was definitely a page turner, and I'm looking forward to reading more of Riley Sager's work, especially if they are thrillers and horrors, because I liked the way it was written. Not entirely what I was expecting, but I definitely very much enjoyed it. The last book that I read this month is When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. Now, if you remember, this was on my most anticipated mid-year reads months ago, and I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for this book to come out. So glad I finally got to read it. It took a while for me to get to be able to read it, but I'm so glad I got to. I will say it was not a 5-star read for me, unfortunately. It ended up being about a 4 stars, which isn't bad. The plot of the novel is Sydney is coming back home to Brooklyn, where she grew up after a pretty nasty divorce in order to take care of her mother, who is not doing well, and also to just kind of get away from the bad relationship she was in. And unfortunately, as is the case in most Brooklyn neighborhoods in the real world, they live in this little small area that is becoming gentrified. So she has white neighbors next to her. There are some like across the street, and it's just, you know, slowly starting to happen where there's more like boutique shops popping up and things like that. This is a house her family has owned for a very long time, and the house is in her family's name, so she's definitely not going anywhere. We're in about a week out to an annual neighborhood block party where she is doing some research on doing a kind of walking tour of the neighborhood to basically give the history of Black lives that have lived there and shaped the neighborhood into what it is today. And she meets and befriends her next door neighbor, who she's kind of had a crush on for a little bit, named Theo. He has the most Karenest of Karen girlfriends. If you know, you know. They strike up a really good friendship, despite the fact that his girlfriend is just pretty terrible and also tries to call the cops on Sydney. As the week goes on, things start getting weirder and weirder. One of her elderly neighbors ends up somehow going to the hospital for his granddaughter, but then she ends up seeing a white couple move into his place with his dog that he always had with him. Things are starting to get weird, and that's kind of where I'll stop with this. And that is probably my biggest criticism with the novel, is it's an extreme horror comment on gentrification and the abuse of Black bodies. In the scope of a plot-driven novel, the characters even comment on this. A lot happens in 7 days. Things go from just like, oh, I have shitty neighbors and whatnot, to literal experimentation, is what I'll say, in the course of a week. I think that was my biggest issue with the book, is just that obviously, you know, it's horror. There's, you know, a fantastical element to it, and what ends up happening to the characters is something that would have been planned for a long time, but not something that probably would happen as quickly for it to go completely under the radar. Maybe that's my whiteness talking and not understanding, but like a bodega is there literally one day and then gets completely changed to a Whole Foods Light with a racist asshole behind the counter the next day. So some of the timelines just don't make sense just because of how quickly it happens. Not that it couldn't happen, but just the speed. It's literally like less than a week a lot of this stuff goes down, and that kind of just took me out of it a little bit. But, you know, I did stay involved, and my other biggest thing is like, I just didn't feel like it was an ending. Like, it was an ending, but like you could do a series of these books because of the type of ending that it left, and I'm not sure how I felt about it. The trauma, the sheer trauma that these characters have gone through, I don't see how it's just kind of like a whatever type of thing. Again, maybe I'm being naive, which is totally possible, but I'm just not seeing the reality in that. But on the whole, the plot and what ends up happening, you know, if it was spread out over a longer period of time, this probably would have been a 5-star read for me. It was really well written, very realistic. Alyssa Cole is an African-American woman, and this is an Own Voices novel, obviously. But she actually does give us a POV for Theo, who is white. So we can even see Theo, who is, you know, white male, seeing these changes happen and being like, that's not right. And what's interesting about Theo's character is that his girlfriend is very much part of a rich family, and he's kind of the other side of the tracks. So even with the race divide, there's also the class divide that it does comment on a little bit. And I was kind of happy that she explored that. You don't really get to see that too much. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I'm so glad I read it. I wish it could have been a 5 stars. Like I said, it was mostly just the timeline of the plot was just way too condensed. Like, this could have been a much longer book. And I think if it was a longer book with a bit more of a timeline in between, it definitely would have been a, you know, 5-star read for me. But I very much suggest you to read this one because it was a lot of fun. And whoo, that sex scene. There is a sex scene, and it is very, very hot, I will say. I was walking down the street listening to it and probably blushing. So that was also very fun. If you liked Get Out You would love this book. I would really love to see this book as well as Monday's Not Coming adapted to a film or TV series, because both could be really amazing. And yeah, I definitely enjoyed this one, and it was a really nice cap off and lead into my October reading. This was really good and definitely suspenseful, and definitely had me on the edge of my seat wondering what was going to happen to these awesome characters, because oh man, the villains were just villainous, that's for sure. So that was all the books I read in September. I tried not to spoil as much as I could, but I know sometimes I did a little bit. I just want to tell everyone about these books when I read them, and I'm trying to make it so that you guys want to read it and I don't just tell you the entire plot. If you guys have read any of these books, please comment down below. I'd love to know your thoughts. If you haven't, let me know which books you're interested to read. This was like an overall really great reading month, and I'm really excited for next month. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!